If I had to explain my family to a stranger, I wouldn't start with names. I'd start with two lists. There was the list of nights they called me. The night my mother's gallbladder gave out, and someone had to sit in a hospital corridor until 4 in the morning filling out forms. The night my sister got the eviction notice taped to her door and called me before she called her own husband. The night the baby, the third one, spiked a fever of 104, and Vanessa couldn't drive because she'd been crying too hard to see. The night our grandmother died, and it was me who made the calls, because someone has to, and that someone, in my family, had a name, and the name was Eleanor. And then there was the other list, the one nobody kept but me, the graduation no one came to, the apartment I bought with my own money that no one ever asked to see, the Christmases where I arrived first to cook and left last to clean, and was thanked somewhere between the dog and the parking situation. There's a family photo on my mother's mantle where you can watch it happen in real time. I'm at the edge, half a shoulder already out of the frame, and everyone else is laughing at something I clearly wasn't told. It took me 30 years to set those two lists side by side. You'd think I'd have noticed sooner. But when you grow up being the one who's always there, you start to believe that being needed and being loved are the same word. They are not. I learned the difference the autumn my sister announced her fourth baby, and my parents announced, in the same breath, what they had decided my life was for. My name is Eleanor Caraway, and this is the story of the night I stopped answering the phone. Hi, I'm Martin. Sit with me for a while. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with Eleanor, 30 years old, a woman who built a quiet, solid life entirely on her own, and a family that decided she had nothing simply because they never once looked. They thought she was the empty chair you could move wherever you needed it. They were about to find out she'd been carrying the whole table. New here, subscribe. We do this every day. Let's go. The invitation to the dinner came by text, the way everything in my family came by text. And the text said only this: Sunday, 6, Moms. Big news. Don't be late. 2 exclamation points. I read it standing in my own kitchen, in the apartment that was mine, holding a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm while I worked. And I felt the small, familiar tightening in my chest that I had spent years learning to ignore. Big news in my family was never my news. Let me tell you about that kitchen first, because I think if you understand the kitchen, you'll understand everything that came after. It was small, a galley, really. You couldn't have 2 people in it without one of them turning sideways. And most nights, there was only ever one of me, so that was fine. But it was mine. I had bought the apartment 2 years before, at 28, with a down payment I had saved one careful deposit at a time over 6 years, working evenings doing the books for a dry cleaner and a dentist and a man who imported tile, while I went to community college during the day. No one helped me. I don't say that bitterly, or I didn't then. I say it because it's the fact at the center of this whole story. I had built the life I was standing in, brick by brick, with my own 2 hands, and not one person in my family had ever asked me how. They didn't ask because they had already decided what I was. I was the easy one, Eleanor, who never gave us any trouble. And in a family, never gave us any trouble is not the compliment it sounds like. It means you learned early that the way to be loved was to need nothing and provide everything. And you got so good at it that eventually no one could see you doing it at all. You became furniture, useful, dependable, and entirely beneath notice until something needed carrying. I'll give you one memory, because it's small, and because the small ones are the truest. When I finished my accounting qualification, 6 years of night classes while I worked, the hardest thing I'd ever done, there was a little ceremony. Nothing grand. A function room, folding chairs, a man reading names off a list, paper cups of warm, sparkling wine afterward. I told my family the date, a month ahead. I'd told them twice. I had 4 tickets, and in the end I gave them to no one, because no one came. My mother had a thing with Vanessa's middle one. My father doesn't like to drive at night. Vanessa was Vanessa. So I sat in a folding chair in a room full of other people's proud families. And when they called my name, I walked up alone and shook a stranger's hand. And I looked out at the rows and found the empty patch of chairs where mine would have been. And I clapped for myself on the inside. Then I drove home, and I stopped on the way at a supermarket and bought a single slice of cake from the bakery case, because it seemed important to mark it somehow. And I ate it standing up at my kitchen counter, still in the blouse I'd ironed that morning, thinking, foolishly, that someone might want a photograph. I'm not telling you that to make you sad. I'm telling you because the arithmetic of it is the whole story, and I'd lived inside it so long I couldn't see it. When the day was hard, the chairs were full. When the day was mine and good, the chairs were empty. I'd had that data my whole life. I just hadn't been willing to add it up, because the sum was a thing I couldn't afford to know and keep loving them at the same time. My sister Vanessa was the other kind of child, the kind who needed things loudly and constantly and was adored for it. Vanessa was 6 years older than me, and from the time I could walk, I understood, in the wordless way children understand the weather of a house, that her storms were events and mine were inconveniences. When Vanessa cried, the whole family rearranged itself around her. When I cried, I was told that I was the sensible one and I should know better. And I learned to do my crying in the bathroom with the tap running, which is a skill, it turns out, that you keep for life. So when the text came, big news, 2 exclamation points, I already knew it would be Vanessa's. I just didn't know yet that this time the news would also be mine, and that I would have no say in either half. I want to be fair to her before I tell you the rest. Because the easy thing would be to make my sister a monster, and she wasn't one, and the truth is more uncomfortable than that. 3 days before the dinner, Vanessa called me, not texted, called, which she almost never did. And the moment I heard her voice, I braced for a crisis, because a call from Vanessa was always a crisis. But she was laughing, crying and laughing at the same time, the way she used to when we were small and something was almost too good to hold. "Ellie," she said, "Ellie, I'm pregnant. We're having another one." And I, God help me, I was happy. I sat down on the edge of my bed and I felt my own eyes go hot, because underneath everything, underneath 30 years of 2 lists, I loved my sister. I had held her 3 children in the first hour of each of their lives. I knew the weight of them. And some old, hopeful, foolish part of me thought, maybe this is the thing that levels us. Maybe a new baby is a fresh start where I get to be an aunt and not an appliance. That's wonderful, I told her, and I meant it. Van, that's really wonderful. You're the first person I told, she said. Before Mom, even. I wanted you to know first. I held on to that for 3 days. You're the first person I told. I want you to remember that she said it, and that it was true, and that it was also, in its way, the beginning of the trap. Because in my family, being the first person told was never about being closest. It was about being recruited. I should have heard it. I didn't. I bought a little stuffed rabbit, cream-colored with long, soft ears, and I wrapped it in tissue paper, and I drove to my mother's house on Sunday at 5:45, because was, the kind of person who is 15 minutes early, and I walked into a room that had already finished a conversation about me without me. You can feel it when a room has been talking about you. There's a particular quality to the silence when you open a door, a quick rearranging of faces, a brightness that comes on too fast, like a light flicked when someone hears the key in the lock. My mother's living room had that quality when I came in. My father was in his chair with the television muted, which meant something, because my father never muted the television for ordinary evenings. Vanessa was on the sofa with her shoes off and her feet tucked under her, blowing, one hand already resting on a stomach that wasn't showing anything yet. And my mother was standing by the mantel, by that photograph, with her arms crossed and her chin lifted in the way she had when she'd reached a decision and was waiting for the room to catch up. Sophie was there too. 15 years old that autumn, all elbows and watchfulness, sitting slightly apart from everyone on the arm of the sofa, with a younger sibling's juice cup in her hand that no one had asked her to hold, but that she was holding anyway. I'll come back to Sophie. For now, just know that she was the only person in that room who looked at me when I came in. Really looked. The way you look at someone when you already know what's about to be done to them. There she is, my mother said. Sit down, Eleanor. We've been waiting. I sat. I put the little wrapped rabbit on the coffee table, and no one looked at it. Vanessa announced the baby again, for my benefit, performing the surprise we'd already had on the phone. And everyone made the sounds you make. And my mother let it run for exactly as long as she could stand before she got to the part she'd actually been waiting to say. So, she said, and she sat down across from me and folded her hands. We've been talking. Your sister's going to have her hands full. 4 children, Eleanor. 4. And Greg's hours are what they are, and the older ones still need running around. And a new baby, well, you know what a new baby is. I didn't, actually. That was rather the point. But I nodded, because nodding was what I did. So we've decided, my mother said. We've decided, and I felt the floor of the evening shift under that phrase, that it makes the most sense for you to step in, properly, full time, once the baby comes. You can give up that little bookkeeping thing or do it on the weekends. I don't know how it works, but during the week, you'll be with the children. It's perfect, really. You're right there. You don't have a husband. You don't have children of your own. You don't have all of that to juggle. This is what family is for, Eleanor. We take care of each other. I want to walk you through that sentence slowly, the way I've walked through it 1,000 times since, because every word in it was a small knife, and the handle of all of them was love. That little bookkeeping thing, the practice I had built, 41 clients by then, a waiting list, the work that had bought the chair my mother was sitting in to tell me to quit it. You don't have a husband, you don't have children of your own, said the way you'd describe an empty room, as if the absence of those 2 things meant the presence of nothing, as if I were a field that had simply never been planted, and the neighborly thing to do was let someone else's crop spread into it. This is what family is for, meaning this is what you are for. I sat very still. I have a stillness I go to, an old one, the bathroom with the tap running stillness, and I went to it then. And in that stillness, I looked around the room at the 4 faces. My mother certain, my father silent, my sister glowing, my niece watching. And I understood that they were not asking me. They had not gathered to ask me. The plan was finished. The creche, I would learn within the hour, had already been told to take Vanessa off the wait list. Vanessa had already mentioned to her supervisor that her sister would be handling the school runs. They had spent my next several years on my behalf, the way you'd spend an inheritance from a relative you assumed was already dead. You haven't said anything, my mother said, and there was the first edge in it. I thought you'd be pleased. I'm thinking, I said. It was the most rebellious sentence I had spoken to my mother in 30 years, and the room reacted to it as though I'd thrown a glass. Here is the thing I have to make you understand about that night, because if you don't understand it, the rest won't land. I almost said yes. I want to be honest with you, the way I've learned to be honest with myself, which took longer. There is a version of me that said yes at that table. She's very real to me. She's the version who had been saying yes her whole life, who knew the exact shape of the relief that floods a room when Eleanor agrees, who was already, even as her mother's edge came out, calculating how she could restructure her clients and keep the early morning appointments and just make it work. Because making it work was the only thing I had ever been praised for. Take that away, and I didn't know what I was. The yes was sitting right there in my mouth. It would have been so easy. It would have bought me, that night, the warmth I had been trying to earn since I was 4 years old. And I'll tell you the ugly part, because the skill of this whole confession is that I won't leave the ugly part out. Part of what stopped me wasn't dignity. Part of it was something smaller and meaner. I looked at my sister, glowing on that sofa, on her fourth child, by a man who could not keep a job past Christmas, rescued from eviction twice by family money that had never once been offered to me. And a thought went through me, clear and cold as tap water. Let her drown. Let her find out what 4 children with no help actually feels like. Let her call me at 2 in the morning and let it ring. I'm not proud of it, but I won't pretend it wasn't there. The people who tell these stories like they were saints the whole way through are lying to you, and I promised myself I'd never do that. I didn't refuse my family that night out of pure principle. I refused them partly out of 30 years of swallowed resentment that had finally found the bottom of the glass. Both things were true. They're still both true. I've made my peace with being a person and not a portrait. I can't give up my practice, I said, and I can't be a full-time babysitter. I love the children. I'll help when I can, like I always have. But not that. Not all of it. No. I'd like to tell you the word came out strong. It didn't. It came out the way a thing comes out when it's been held under water for 3 decades, a little broken, a little gasping. But it came out. No. The first real no of my life, in my mother's living room, over a stuffed rabbit nobody had unwrapped. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother laughed. Not a cruel laugh. That's the part people never believe. A light, disbelieving, almost fond laugh. The laugh you give a child who has said something absurd. Don't be silly, Eleanor, she said. Of course you can. And that, more than anything else that was said that night, is the sentence I carried home. Of course you can. Because in her mind, there was no version of me that wouldn't. I wasn't a person who might say no. I was a resource that had briefly malfunctioned, and she was confident it would right itself, because it always had. I didn't right myself. That was the new thing. The week after the dinner was a study in how a family applies pressure to a person it is sure will fold. And I want to take my time here, through this stretch, because this is the part the years are actually made of. Not the dramatic moments, but the small daily weather of being slowly informed of your own unimportance. The pressure didn't come as a fight. It came as a series of assumptions, each one delivered as though my no had simply never happened. Vanessa called on Monday to ask if I could take Sophie and Liam on Thursday, just to practice the routine. On Tuesday, my mother emailed me a printed schedule. She had typed it up, color-coded, the kind of document she'd never once made for anything of mine, with my name in a column across 5 weekdays, from 7 in the morning to 6 at night, as though my consent were a clerical detail that would be filled in later. On Wednesday, my father called, which he never did, and talked about the weather for 4 minutes, and then said, "Your mother's upset, Ellie. You know how she gets. Just don't make it a whole thing," and hung up before I could answer. Don't make it a whole thing. As if I were the one making it anything. As if a no were a tantrum and a yes were just peace. I kept that color-coded schedule, by the way. I have it still in a drawer. Some nights I take it out and look at it, my name in a tidy column, Monday through Friday, 7 to 6. The boxes my mother had filled in for years of my life, as casually as you'd fill in a chore wheel. There's something almost admirable in the confidence of it. She didn't ask me for the time, because in her mind the time was already hers. She was only informing me of an allocation that had been decided at a level above my consent. I think that document taught me more than any cruel sentence did. A cruel sentence you can dismiss as temper, but you don't make a color-coded spreadsheet of someone's surrender in the heat of the moment. You make it because you genuinely never imagined the answer could be no. The calm of it was the cruelest thing about it. In the middle of that same week, I had a meeting with a client, Mr. Adler, who imports tile, who'd been with me since I was doing his books at a kitchen table for $40 a month. He's nearly 80 now. He came into my office, which is a real office, small but mine, with my name on the glass, and he sat down and looked at the certificates on the wall and the orderly shelves, and he said, "You know, Eleanor, I've had 4 accountants in my life. You're the only one who ever made me feel like my money was safe with a person instead of a machine." He meant nothing by it. It was just an old man being kind on a Tuesday. But I had to turn and straighten something on a shelf so he wouldn't see my face, because it had been a week of being told I was nothing but available, and here was a near stranger telling me I was the most trustworthy person he'd ever handed his life to. The gap between those 2 reports was so wide, I couldn't see how both could be about the same woman. They were, though. The difference was only who was looking and whether they wanted to find anything there. On Friday, Vanessa stopped pretending to ask. She arrived at my apartment a little after 8 in the morning, the first time she'd ever come to it, and she didn't come in. She just appeared at the door with Liam by the hand and the baby, Mia, on her hip, and a diaper bag she held out to me like a baton in a relay I hadn't agreed to run. "I've got an appointment," she said, which may even have been true, "just for a few hours. You're home anyway. You're home anyway." The whole philosophy of my life in 3 words. And then she was gone down the stairs before I'd said yes or no, because yes or no had stopped being information she required. Here's the part I have to own. I took them. Of course I took them. You cannot hand an 8-year-old and a toddler back down a stairwell. I took Liam's hand, and I balanced Mia on my hip, and I spent the day being exactly what they decided I would be. And the worst part, the part I'm least proud of, is that I was good at it, and some of it was lovely. Mia fell asleep on my chest in the green chair, and I sat there, not daring to move, breathing in the warm bread smell of her head, loving her so much it frightened me, and I understood with total clarity how the trap was built. It was built out of love. They didn't need to chain me. They just had to hand me a sleeping child and let my own heart do the locking. Greg came to collect them at 6, 2 hours later than Vanessa had said, smelling faintly of a bar, full of the easy warmth of the man who has never once in his life been the person holding the bag. "You're a lifesaver, Ellie," he said, beaming, scooping up Mia. "Honestly, don't know what we'd do without you." And he said it so kindly, so genuinely that I almost missed the thing underneath it, which was that "don't know what we'd do without you" is not gratitude. It's a job description. He clapped me on the shoulder on his way out, like a foreman approving a shift, and I stood in my own doorway and watched my family carry my afternoon down the stairs, and I thought, they will call this proof. Tomorrow my mother will say, "But you watched them Friday. What's the difference?" And she did. There was a Sunday lunch in the middle of all this. The family still gathered on Sundays, and I still went, because not going hadn't yet occurred to me as a thing a person could do. And at that lunch, I watched the machine work in public, which is different from watching it work on the phone, because in public there are witnesses, and the witnesses are part of how it works. My Aunt Carol was there, and 2 cousins, and a neighbor of my mother's who'd been folded into the family the way some neighbors are. And over the roast, my mother said to the whole table brightly, "Eleanor's going to be helping Vanessa with the new baby, full time. Isn't that wonderful?" She said it not to me, but about me, to the table, so that the table would do the work of agreeing before I could do the work of declining. And it did. The cousins cooed. The neighbor said, "Oh, how lovely, what a good sister, my Aunt Carol." 11 trips to chemotherapy the year before, I'll say it again, patted my hand and said, "You're an angel, you know that?" And I sat there with the word angel landing on me like a net, because that's what the praise was, a net, thrown in company so that struggling against it would look like ingratitude in front of everyone who just admired me for holding still. I almost let it close. That's the thing I need you to understand about how these families work. The public praise is more powerful than the private command, because to refuse it, you have to embarrass not just yourself, but everyone who just called you an angel. I sat there and felt the yes rising again, the old reflex, the need to be the good thing they just announced me to be. And then I looked down the table and saw Sophie clearing plates she hadn't been asked to clear. Already the angel in training. Already being praised in exactly the same key. Sophie's such a help. And I put my fork down and I said to the table quietly, "Actually, I haven't agreed to that." The temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees. My mother laughed her light laugh and said, "She's being modest," and moved the conversation on. And I understood that in public, there is no version of my refusal that they will even allow to be heard. It will be edited in real time into modesty, into a mood, into anything but a no. That was the lunch where I realized I'd have to say it somewhere there were no witnesses to retranslate it. That a no, in my family, needed a closed door to survive. I started keeping a record. I'm a bookkeeper. It's what I do when the world stops making sense. I make a ledger of it, because numbers don't lie, even when people do. I sat at my own kitchen table one night and I wrote down 2 columns, and I called them privately the way you name a thing you're ashamed to need. Times I was called and times I was asked. The first column took up the page, 30 years of it. Hospitals and evictions and fevers and funerals and airport runs and loans that were called gifts when they went to Vanessa and were never offered at all to me. The second column had almost nothing in it. A handful of birthdays, Sophie sometimes. That was nearly all. And then I did the thing that I think actually changed me more than the no had. I am a bookkeeper, so I did the other math too. I went back through my own records. I keep everything. It's a professional deformity. And I added up what my family had given my sister over the years. The eviction money, twice. The car when Greg's died. The loan for the second baby that was never repaid and never mentioned. It came to a number I won't say out loud here, because it doesn't matter. What matters is that beside it, I wrote what my family had given me toward my own life. My own apartment, my own practice, the things I had built with my hands. And the number beside my name was 0. Not a small number, 0. They had poured everything they had into the child who needed loudly, and given nothing to the child who needed quietly. And then they had looked at the result, at the sister who was drowning and the sister who was solvent, and concluded that the solvent one, the one with nothing going on, was the one with time to spare. I sat with that ledger for a long while, and I understood finally that I was not the empty field. I never had been. I was the one who had planted myself, alone in soil no one had bothered to water, and grown anyway. And the reward for growing was that they assumed I'd grown for them. Not the night I stopped hurting. That took much longer. But the guilt went out of me like a tide, and what it left behind was very quiet and very clear. I spent some of those quiet weeks trying to understand my mother, because the ledger had answered what, but not why. And I'm the kind of person who can't close a book until the columns reconcile. And I can't prove it, but I think, I finally found the root of it, and it was older than me. My mother was a useful daughter, too. I'd forgotten that, or never let myself see it. She was the eldest of 4, and when her own mother got sick, a long sickness, years of it, it was my mother, 16, who left school to nurse her, while the younger ones went on to their lives. She gave up a place at a teaching college she never spoke about except once, bitterly, at a wedding, after wine. She spent her youth holding a dying woman and watching her siblings be free. And no one ever asked who was holding her, either. I come from a line of women who were spent. My grandmother spent my mother, and my mother handed a daughter who was quiet and capable and easy to overlook. Did not look at me and think, never again. She looked at me and thought, with a kind of relief she'd never have admitted to, finally, someone to carry it for me. The pattern doesn't break itself. It chooses a new back and climbs on. I don't say this to excuse her. Understanding why a thing rolls downhill doesn't mean you have to stand at the bottom and let it land on you. But it changed the shape of my anger. I stopped seeing a villain and started seeing a relay, a baton of unpaid devotion handed down through women who'd each been told it was love. And I understood that the no I'd said in her living room wasn't only refusing a babysitting schedule. It was the first time in 3 generations that the baton hit the ground. And standing over it, looking down, I thought of Sophie. And I knew I would rather they hate me forever than bend down and pick it up and put it in her hand. Let me tell you about the chair, because I told you I would tell you about the mundane things, and because the chair matters more to me than almost anything else in this story, and I want you to understand why. When I bought my apartment, I had no furniture. I'd spent every cent I had on the down payment, and for the first 2 months, I slept on a mattress on the floor and ate sitting against the wall, and I was happy, in the strange, fierce way you're happy when a thing is finally yours. And after those 2 months, when I'd saved a little, I went to a furniture shop on a Saturday, by myself, and I bought one chair, a real one, an armchair, deep green with a high back and worn brass studs along the arms, second-hand but good, the kind of chair a person reads in. It cost more than I'd ever spent on a single object that wasn't a necessity. And I remember standing in the shop, arguing with myself about whether I was allowed to want it, because wanting things, for me, had always felt like a kind of theft from people who needed more. I bought the chair. I had it delivered. And when the men had gone, I sat down in it, in my empty apartment, in the late gold light of a Saturday afternoon, and I cried. Not the bathroom tap crying, a different kind. The kind that comes when you realize you are allowed to take up space in your own life. I called my mother that evening because I was so happy I wanted to tell someone, and I said, "Mom, I bought a chair. You should see it. It's beautiful." And she said, "That's nice, dear. Listen, your sister's having a hard week. Can you call her?" And I said, yes, of course I would call her. And I hung up, and I sat in my beautiful chair in my beautiful empty apartment. And I understood that the good list and the bad list were never going to balance, because only one of us was keeping both. No one in my family ever saw that chair. In 2 years, not one of them ever came to my home. They knew the address the way you know a fact you'll never use. When the babysitting plan came, my mother said, "You're right there," as if my apartment were a waiting room attached to their lives. And the truth is, she had never once crossed its threshold to find out what was actually in it. There was a whole life in it. There was a green chair she'd never sat in, and a kitchen she'd never stood in, and a window I'd watched 100 sunsets from, alone and content and entirely unseen. I tell you about the chair because when people imagine a woman with nothing going on, they imagine emptiness, quiet rooms, sad evenings, a life waiting to be filled by someone else's children. And I want you to know that my quiet rooms were not empty. They were full of a life I had made on purpose, that no one had helped me make, that no one had ever bothered to look at. The tragedy of my family was not that they were cruel to me. It's that they never once were curious about me. And you cannot love what you refuse to be curious about. You can only use it. Sophie was the one who broke it open. I have to tell you about Sophie now, because everything turns on her, and because if there's a single person in this story I'd walk back into that family for, it's her. She came to my apartment on a Thursday, the Thursday I was supposed to be practicing the routine, except I had told Vanessa no, and Vanessa had dropped Liam and our mothers in a fury and sent Sophie over to me alone, I think as a kind of guilt courier, 15 years old and dispatched to shame her aunt into compliance. Sophie rang my bell, and I let her up, and she stood in my doorway and looked past me into the apartment, at the green chair, at the books, at the small, clean order of a life, and she said, very quietly, "I've never been here before." "No," I said, "you haven't. It's nice." She said it like a discovery. Mom said it was just a little place. "It's a little place," I agreed. "It's mine." I made her tea, and she sat in my green chair because I told her she could, And for a while, we didn't talk about any of it. And then she did the thing that children do, the terrible, clear-eyed thing where they say the true sentence the adults have all agreed not to say. She was turning her cup in her hands, and she said, not looking at me, "They're going to make me do it, you know. When you say no, the baby, they've already started." She told me how, just that week, her mother had said that Sophie would need to step up, pull back from the swim team, drop the after-school job she'd been so proud of, be home by 3 to take the younger ones so Vanessa could rest. She told me how her grandmother had said approvingly that Sophie was such a good girl, such a help, not boy crazy like the other girls. She told me, 15 years old, in my green chair, that she had heard her future being arranged in the next room, and that it sounded exactly like mine. "They do to you what they're starting to do to me," she said. "I watched them do it your whole life. I don't want to be the next you, Aunt Ellie, and I feel terrible saying that because you're the only one who ever actually shows up for me. But I don't want to be you. I'm scared I'm going to be you. I have thought about that sentence every day since. I'm scared I'm going to be you." It was the cruelest thing anyone said to me in the whole of this, and she didn't mean it cruelly at all, and that's why it worked. Because she was right. The family had a slot, a particular slot, for the girl who would be useful and unmarried and endlessly available. And they had filled it with me, and the moment I stepped out of it, they were already measuring Sophie for it. My no wasn't just about me anymore. If I said yes, I wasn't only surrendering my own life. I was holding the slot warm for her. "You're not going to be me," I told her. And it was the first promise I'd made in years that I had no idea how to keep. I tried first to do it the gentle way. I want that on the record because of what they said about me afterward. I did not start a war. I tried to set a boundary like a reasonable adult, and I learned, the way so many of us learn, that to a family built on your compliance, a boundary is indistinguishable from an attack. I went to my mother's house on a weekday evening, by myself, and I sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and I tried to explain. I told her I loved Vanessa and the children. I told her I would help, real help, babysitting some evenings, the occasional emergency, the way I always had. But not full time, not giving up my work, not erasing my life into theirs. I said it calmly. I'd practiced it in the car. And I offered her a compromise that cost me more than it should have. And I watched it land on a woman who had never in my lifetime accepted a compromise from me because she had never had to. She heard me out. I'll give her that. And then she said in a voice gone cool and final, "I don't understand what happened to you. You used to be such a generous person. Used to be." As though declining to dissolve myself was a character defect I'd recently developed. As though 30 years of generosity were a tab I'd been running and had now, scandalously, refused to keep paying. "Mom," I said, "I'm offering to help." "Help," she repeated, like the word disgusted her. "Your sister doesn't need help, Eleanor. She needs you. There's a difference. Family doesn't help. Family shows up." And then she said the thing she'd been saving, the thing I think she'd wanted to say for years, and had finally been given the excuse. She looked at me across her kitchen, and she said, "I'll tell you what your problem is. You've been alone so long, you've forgotten how to be part of anything. No wonder no man ever stayed. Who'd want a woman who counts what she gives? Who'd want a woman who counts what she gives?" I have framed that sentence in my mind, the way you'd frame a thing you survived. Because she meant it to end me, and it nearly did, in that kitchen. It reached straight past 30 years and found the 4-year-old doing her crying with the tap running. The girl who'd always believed that if she just gave enough, asked for little enough, she would finally be wanted. And here was her mother telling her that the giving had been the problem all along, that the very thing she'd built her whole self around had made her unlovable. I didn't cry in front of her. I want you to know that. I got up and I said, "I think I should go," and my voice was steady, and I drove home, and I sat in my green chair in the dark, and I did not turn on a single light, and I let the worst of it move through me where no one could watch. What followed was the part I think of as the long cold. It lasted about 6 weeks, and it was the closest I have come, as an adult, to losing my own thread entirely. I want to slow all the way down here, because if you've ever stood your ground with people who hold the keys to your belonging, you know that the punishment for it is rarely loud. It's a slow withdrawal of the warmth you didn't know you were still living on. The phone calls stopped. After a lifetime of being the first one dialed, I went 6 weeks without a single call from my mother. And I want to tell you that the silence was a relief, but for the first weeks it wasn't. It was a kind of starvation. I hadn't understood how much of my sense of being a person had come from being needed by them until the need was switched off. I'd pick up my phone and there'd be nothing, and I'd feel the strangest grief. Grief for a thing that had never actually been good to me. You can mourn a cage if it's the only home you've known. What kept me from drowning in those weeks was a woman named Maya, and I should have told you about her sooner, because she is the answer to every person who looked at my life and saw emptiness. Maya owned the bookshop 2 doors down from the dry cleaner whose accounts I'd done for years, and we'd become, over a decade of small Tuesdays, the thing my family never managed to be: chosen and easy and unconditional. She had no idea about most of this until the cold set in and I went quiet, and she noticed I'd gone quiet, which is its own kind of miracle, that someone noticed the absence of me. She turned up at my door with soup I hadn't asked for, and sat in the green chair and made me tell her the whole thing. And when I got to the part about who'd want a woman who counts what she gives, she put down her cup and said, "Ellie, you count what you give because you spent 30 years giving to people who never counted at all. That's not a flaw. That's a receipt." And she said, "I've watched you show up for half this neighborhood. You are the least empty person I know. They didn't fail to see your life. They refused to. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole crime. There's a woman across the hall from me, too, Mrs. Petrakis, widowed, 81, who I check on most mornings. A knock. Are you all right, Anna? A hand with a jar lid, or a form from the council. During the cold, she noticed I'd gone gray around the edges, the way the very old notice things the busy miss. And one morning, she held my wrist in her dry, papery hand and said, "Whoever it is, Eleanor, they don't know what they have. People never do with the steady ones. They think steady means it costs you nothing." 81 years old, and she'd read in 1 week what my own mother hadn't read in 30. I've thought about why that is. I think it's because the people who lean on you can't afford to see the cost. If they saw it, they'd have to stop, or carry the weight of not stopping. So they decide it's free. The strangers, the ones who owe you nothing, are the only ones who can afford to notice what you're carrying. That's the loneliest math in this whole story, and I checked it twice, and it holds. I did a lot of thinking in the green chair those weeks, in the dark, with the lamp off, and I'll tell you the shape of it, because the thinking is the part of these stories that usually gets skipped, and it's the part I'd most want someone like me to hear. I thought about whether I was being cruel. I genuinely did. I'm not one of those people who decides she's right and sleeps fine. I lay awake asking myself if a better woman would simply have said yes, would have folded her own small life up and made room. Because isn't that what love is? And I kept arriving at the same answer, slowly, like something surfacing. Sacrifice is love when it's chosen and shared, when it's assigned, when one person is appointed to do all the bleeding so the others never have to. That isn't love. That's a tax. And I had been the only one paying it for so long that everyone, including me, had started calling the tax a virtue. I decided, somewhere in those dark hours, that I was done being virtuous in that particular way. I would be generous when I chose to be. I would never again be generous because I'd been billed. And the strangest thing happened once I decided it. I started sleeping better than I had in years. It turned out a great deal of my exhaustion had never been the giving. It had been the not being allowed to choose. Then came the story. Families have a way of writing the story before you can, and mine wrote a good one. The version that traveled to the aunts and the cousins and my mother's church friends was simple and devastating. Eleanor had abandoned her pregnant sister. Eleanor, who had no children of her own and all that free time, had refused to lift a finger for family while poor Vanessa struggled. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who I'd driven to chemotherapy 11 times the year before, 11 times, I have the calendar, left me a voicemail I still don't fully have the heart to describe, in which she told me she was disappointed in the woman I'd become. The woman I'd become. I wanted to call her back and read her the 11 dates. I didn't. There's no winning an argument about your own character with people who've already decided to need the version where you're the villain. It spread the way these things spread, through the soft channels. A cousin who'd always liked me went cool, then silent. An invitation to a christening that the year before I'd have been expected to quietly cater simply never came. My mother's church friends, women who'd known me since I was small, developed a way of looking at me in the supermarket that I can only describe as gentle disappointment, the look you give a dog that's bitten someone, sorrow and wariness in equal measure. None of them asked me what had happened. That's the part that still amazes me. Not one of the dozen people who revised their opinion of me ever called to ask if the story was even true. The story was useful. It kept the family shape intact, the good sister struggling and the cold sister who'd failed her. And a useful story doesn't get fact-checked. I had spent my whole life as the family's most reliable fact, and I learned in those weeks how quickly a fact can be edited once it stops being convenient. My father called once during the cold. Once. I want to put it here because it's the closest thing to an ally I got from my own blood, and you need to see how small it was to understand what I was working with. He called on a weekday afternoon and talked about the gutters for a while, and the car, and a man from his old job who died. And then there was a silence. And into the silence he said, "You know, Ellie, your mother, she doesn't always." And he stopped. He just stopped. Whatever the end of that sentence was, he couldn't afford to say it, because saying it would have meant taking a side in his own house. And my father had spent 40 years keeping the peace by being absent from every room where the peace was actually being broken. "Anyway," he said, "you're a good girl." And he hung up. A good girl. The same words he'd used my whole life. The words that had always meant, please keep being easy, so I never have to be brave. I sat with the phone a long time after. He was the only one who came close to seeing it, and even he could only get within one unfinished sentence before he closed the door, the way he always had, gently, from his side. And then Vanessa cut off Sophie. That was the one that nearly broke my resolve. Word reached me, through Sophie herself, in a text sent from a friend's phone, that her mother had told her she wasn't to see me anymore, that I was going through something and not a good influence right now. A 15-year-old quarantined from the one adult who'd ever shown up for her as a punishment aimed at me. Sophie's text said, "I'm okay, don't worry, I'll figure it out." 15 years old, comforting me. I read it standing in a grocery store, and I had to put down my basket and walk outside. I came so close in those weeks to calling my mother and saying I'd do it, all of it, the full time, the giving up of my practice, the whole erasure, just to make the cold stop, just to get Sophie back, just to be allowed back into the warm. I had the phone in my hand more than once. I'm telling you this so you know it wasn't easy and it wasn't clean. The night I came closest, I sat in my green chair with the phone lit up in my hand and my mother's name on the screen. And I thought about Sophie saying, "I'm scared I'm going to be you." And I understood that if I called, if I folded, I wouldn't only be locking my own cage, I'd be welding shut hers. And I put the phone down, not because I was strong, because I finally had something I was more afraid of losing than their approval. I want to be truthful about how that 6 weeks ended, Bo, because it did not end with me rescued. It ended with a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, where nothing happened at all. No call, no crisis, no breakthrough. And I made myself dinner and ate it in my green chair and realized, somewhere around the second forkful, that I was, against all odds, all right, that the floor had not fallen out of the world, that I had been so certain my whole life that their warmth was the thing keeping me alive, and here I was, 6 weeks without it. It was the quietest victory I have ever won, and it didn't feel like a victory at all. It felt like waking up in a room you'd been told all your life had no door, and finding the door, and finding it had always been unlocked. The phone rang at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in November, and it was my mother, and I want to tell you exactly what I did, because everything in my life divides into before that ring and after it. I was asleep. The phone woke me, the old ringtone I'd assigned to her years ago, a particular tone I'd chosen so that even half asleep I'd know to leap up, because a call from my mother at 2 in the morning had always meant someone needed carrying. I came up out of sleep the way I'd been trained to, heart already going, hand already reaching, the whole machinery of 30 years firing before my eyes were even open. Eleanor, awake, needed, go, and then I stopped. I lay in the dark, and I watched the phone ring on the nightstand. My mother's name, lit up, buzzing, insistent. And I did the hardest thing I have ever done, which was nothing. I did not answer it. I lay still and I let it ring, and it rang out, and the room went quiet, and then it started again, and I let it ring again. 3 times she called. 3 times I lay in the dark and let my own hand stay where it was. I have never been so frightened of a piece of furniture in my life as I was of that phone, and I have never been prouder of anything as I am of not picking it up. I'll tell you what it was. I learned later, in pieces. My father had fallen, not seriously as it turned out, a stumble on the back step, a sprained wrist, a fright more than an injury. But at 2 in the morning, frightened, in pain, my mother had reached for the phone, and the name her hand had gone to, out of 30 years of habit, before her husband's own brother, before an ambulance, before anyone, was mine. Eleanor will know what to do. Eleanor will come. Eleanor always comes. And Eleanor didn't come. She had to call Vanessa in the end. And Vanessa, pregnant and exhausted and 3 children deep, had to get out of bed and drive across town in the dark and sit in the emergency room until dawn and fill out the forms and be the one. For the first time in either of their lives, my sister had to be the one. And I lay in my own bed, in my own apartment, in the life I had built, and I did not move. And somewhere across the city, the 2 lists finally began to balance. I didn't sleep. I won't pretend I lay there in serene triumph. I lay there shaking, sick with it. Every cell in my body screaming that I was a bad daughter, a bad person, that my father was hurt, and I was failing the one test I had always passed. That's what they don't tell you about the moment you finally stop. It doesn't feel like freedom. You are killing the version of yourself. That was the only version they ever loved. And even though she was killing you, you grieve her because she was you. But I didn't pick up the phone. They came for me 3 days later. And this is the part where, if this were a film, I would have stood up and made a speech, and everyone would have wept and seen the light. I want to tell you it wasn't like that, because it wasn't, and because the truth of how it actually went is the only thing in this story I'm genuinely proud of. My mother and Vanessa came to my apartment together, the first time either of them had ever set foot in it in the 2 years I'd lived there. And they came not to see it, but to confront me. They stood in my doorway, and I watched my mother's eyes do a quick, involuntary tour of the place she'd never bothered to enter. And I watched her see it: the green chair, the wall of books, the kitchen with one wine glass drying by the sink. A whole life, ordered and real, and entirely unfamiliar to her. The life of a stranger she happened to have given birth to. "Your father could have died," she said. "No hello. And you didn't answer. I called you 3 times, Eleanor. 3 times. Where were you?" And here is the thing I had learned in 6 weeks of cold and one night of not answering. I did not have to raise my voice. I had spent my whole life believing that to be heard in my family, I'd have to finally get loud, finally break, finally match their volume. And standing in my own doorway, I understood that I never needed to be loud at all. I just needed to stop translating myself into a language built to erase me. I was here, I said, in my home, asleep, the way most people are at 2 in the morning. Your sister had to. My sister had to do one time what I have done for this family every time for 30 years, I said, and I'm glad she did. Not because I wanted Dad hurt. I'm glad because now there are 2 of you who know what it weighs. My mother started to speak, and I did something I had never once done in my life. I kept talking. Quietly. I didn't let her have the floor by default. I told her about the 2 lists. I told her about the column of times I was called and the column of times I was asked, and how one filled a page and the other was nearly blank. I told her about the chair she'd never sat in, and the graduation no one came to, and the apartment she'd never entered until she needed something from inside it. I told her, and this was the part where Vanessa's face changed, about the ledger, the other one, the money, about the number beside Vanessa's name and the 0 beside mine, and how they looked at the daughter they'd given everything and the daughter they'd given nothing, and decided the one with nothing was the one with everything to spare. I didn't say it as an accusation. I'm a bookkeeper. There is nothing colder, I have learned, than the truth read out in a level voice by someone who has stopped needing you to like it. You decided I had nothing going on, I said. You decided it so completely that you never once looked to see if it was true. It wasn't. I have a whole life. I built it myself, with no help from anyone in this room, and it is full, and it is mine. And the reason you thought it was empty is that you never asked me a single question about it in 30 years. You didn't think I had nothing. You needed me to, because a person with nothing can be spent, and a person with a life of her own has to be asked. While I was speaking, I watched Vanessa, and I want to tell you what her face did, because it's the only revenge I ever actually wanted, and I didn't even know it until I got it. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was recognition. She was hearing the number beside her own name for the first time. All the rescues, all the gifts that were called loans, and the loans that were called nothing, laid next to the 0 beside mine. And she was understanding, in real time, that her whole life had been subsidized by a family that had decided her sister's life was the budget it would be drawn from. She put her hand over her mouth. She didn't defend it. To her enormous credit, in that one moment, she didn't say a single word to make it smaller. The room was very quiet. My father wasn't there. He was home, wrist in a brace, and I find out later he cried when Vanessa told him what had happened, though whether at the fall or at the rest of it, I never knew, and I never asked. And that's one of the things in this story that I've simply let stay unfinished. Some questions you decide not to open. My mother didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that, because the films always give you the apology, and life so rarely does. She stood in my doorway, and she looked at my green chair, and something moved across her face that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have just been the recalculation of a woman realizing a resource was truly gone. I'll never know which. She said finally, "Well, I see you've made up your mind," as if my whole life were a mood I'd settled into, and she left. Vanessa stayed a moment longer. Vanessa was the one who surprised me. I'll give you that before I close, because the easy ending would leave her a villain, and she didn't stay one. She lingered in my doorway after our mother had gone down to the car, and she looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw my actual sister in there. Not the glowing recruiter from the sofa, not the perpetual emergency, but the girl who'd once told me I was the first person she told. She said, I didn't know about the money, the zero. I didn't, and she stopped, because there wasn't a way to finish it that didn't indict everyone who'd raised us. And then she said the thing that I think cost her the most, the thing I hadn't known I needed until she said it. You held all of them, every time. I never once asked who was holding you. I never once asked who was holding you. From the good list, finally. 30 years late, one entry, but real. I didn't fall into her arms. We're not that kind of family, and one true sentence doesn't undo a childhood. But something unlocked, a little, between us. She's the one who said Sophie back to me, quietly, without telling our mother, the way you do the first brave thing in a family that's punished bravery out of you. And Sophie came back to my green chair, and she stayed on the swim team, and she kept the after-school job she was proud of. And when it came time to apply for the program she wanted, a marine biology summer thing, 3 states away, terrifying and expensive and entirely hers, it was me who helped her with the application, and me she called when she got in, and I was the first person she told. The first person. I know what that's worth. I made sure it meant the thing it's supposed to mean. Things changed for Vanessa too, though not the way a tidy story would want. Greg didn't transform. He's still Greg. But the night of our father's fall, when she had to be the one in the emergency room until dawn, something in her recalibrated. She'd spent her life being caught, and she'd just found out, at 36, that she could also catch. She started in small ways to stand on her own legs. She found a part-time job that was hers. She stopped calling me first for every fright, partly out of guilt, I think, and partly because she was discovering she didn't always need to. We are not close the way sisters are close in films, but we are, for the first time, 2 adults instead of a rescuer and a rescued, and that's a thing I never thought we'd be. I find I'd rather have the honest distance than the old false closeness that was really just me carrying her and calling it love. A 4th baby came in the spring, a girl, and they named her something pretty, and I sent the cream-colored rabbit I'd bought back in the autumn, the one no one had ever unwrapped. I held her once, in the first week, the way I'd held all of them. I love her. I'm her aunt. I am not her mother, and I am not her keeper, and I am for the first time allowed to be only and exactly what I am. People ask me, the few people I've told, whether I forgave my mother. I never know how to answer it, because forgiveness was never really the shape of it. We talk now, sometimes, less than we did. She calls when she needs something still, out of old habit. And sometimes I help, and sometimes I don't. And the difference now is that it's a choice, and we both know it. The need is no longer a command. That's the whole change. It doesn't look like much from the outside. She left me a voicemail once, a few months after all of it, and I never listened to the whole thing. I saw it was long, and I saw it was from her, and I sat in my green chair with my thumb over it, and I decided, for once, that I got to choose what I let in. I never played it. It's still there. I don't know what it says. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was a request. I decided I could live without knowing more easily than I could live with finding out it was the second one. Some doors you just leave shut. I took the trip, by the way. The one they'd assumed I'd cancel. The one I'd saved years for. I went alone, and it was the best 3 weeks of my life, and I have a photograph from it on my own mantle now, in my own apartment. Me, at the center of the frame, no one edging me out, taken by a stranger I'd asked because I wanted just once to be the person in the picture instead of the person holding it. I booked it years before in my head and never let myself spend the money because there had always been someone who needed it more. A deposit, a fever, a fund for a child who wasn't mine. This time, I spent it on myself, and I waited for the guilt, and the guilt didn't come. I sat on a stone wall above a sea I'd only ever seen on calendars, and I ate an orange, and I let myself understand that I had not abandoned anyone. I had simply finally included myself on the list of people I was allowed to take care of. It had taken 30 years to earn a place on my own list. I don't intend to ever come off it again. Tonight, Sophie's coming over. She does that now, on her own, a grown thing arriving at her aunt's door because she wants to, and not because she's been sent. I made tea. I'm sitting in the green chair my mother never sat in the home she finally entered, only to find a life she'd sworn wasn't there. The phone's on the table beside me. It doesn't ring the way it used to. I've never been so glad of a quiet thing in all my life.